I stood at the edge of the Riverside Country Club's marble dance floor, watching crystal glasses catch the afternoon light and designer gowns swirl like expensive clouds. The Connecticut countryside stretched beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, all rolling green hills and picture-perfect charm. Everything looked like a fairy tale. Everything except me. I wore a navy dress from Target and shoes I'd owned for 3 years, clutching a small purse that held exactly $43 and some loose change. My sister Victoria glided across the room in $8,000 worth of silk and Swarovski crystals, accepting congratulations like a queen receiving tribute. Then she reached for the microphone. Her eyes found mine across the crowded ballroom, and her perfect smile turned predatory. I knew that look. I'd been seeing it my whole life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The microphone screeched with feedback as Victoria tapped it, and conversations died throughout the ballroom. She stood radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown, her blonde hair swept into an elaborate updo that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Beside her, Michael looked handsome in his tailored tuxedo, though I caught him glancing nervously at his new bride. He had no idea what was coming. Neither did the 200 guests who turned their attention toward the happy couple, champagne glasses raised in anticipation of heartfelt words. Victoria's voice rang out clear and sweet, the same tone she'd used to charm teachers and boyfriends since we were children. Thank you all so much for being here on the most magical day of my life. Michael and I are overwhelmed by your love and support. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd of Connecticut's social elite, her sorority sisters, Michael's family from Boston, and our own relatives who'd driven up from New York. When her eyes landed on me again, standing near the back with my 7-year-old daughter Lily, her smile sharpened. I want to thank my family for always believing in me, especially my mother, who taught me that a woman should never settle for less than she deserves. Patricia Richardson beamed from the head table, diamonds glittering at her throat, looking every inch the proud mother of the bride. She'd worn that same expression when Victoria graduated summa cum laude from Yale, when she landed her dream job at a Manhattan marketing firm, when she got engaged to Michael at Christmas in front of the whole family. Victoria continued, her voice taking on that slightly syrupy quality I recognized from childhood. Some people might say that at 26 I'm young to be getting married. But when you know, you know. When you find someone who sees your worth, who wants to build a life with you, who's ready to commit completely, why wait? She turned to Michael, who squeezed her hand and smiled adoringly. The crowd murmured appreciation. Then Victoria's tone shifted, became more conversational, more intimate, as if she were sharing a secret with her closest friends. Of course, not everyone is as fortunate in love as Michael and I have been. Take my sister Emma, for instance. 200 faces turned toward me. I felt Lily's small hand slip into mine and squeeze tight. My daughter had inherited my intuition for trouble. Emma's here tonight, and I'm so proud of her for making the effort. I know it can't be easy being 29 and still figuring things out. Still raising Lily on her own. Still living in that little apartment in Hartford. Still waiting for someone to see her potential. Victoria's voice dripped with false sympathy. A few people made soft sounds of pity. Others looked uncomfortable. Michael's expression grew confused. My chest tightened, but I kept my face neutral. I'd learned long ago not to react to Victoria's needles in public. It only encouraged her. Lily looked up at me, her dark eyes wide with concern. She was too young to understand the cruelty, but she sensed the tension. The truth is, Victoria said, raising her champagne glass higher, some women are meant to be brides, and others are meant to be, cautionary tales. Emma's been so busy playing house with different men over the years, never quite managing to seal the deal. But that's okay. Not everyone can find their Prince Charming. Some of us just have to keep hoping that someday, maybe, If they're very lucky and very patient, someone might finally want them enough to propose. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but not from embarrassment, from rage, from years of accumulated insults and dismissals and casual cruelties that Victoria delivered like gifts. I thought of every family dinner where she'd asked pointed questions about my love life, every holiday where she'd made comments about Lily needing a father figure, every phone call where she'd offered unsolicited advice about my choices. Patricia nodded approvingly from her seat, as if Victoria had just delivered a touching tribute instead of a public humiliation. Some guests laughed nervously. Others studied their plates. Michael looked mortified, clearly realizing that his new wife had just eviscerated her own sister in front of everyone they knew. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to grab Lily and walk out of that marble and crystal palace and drive back to our small apartment where nobody pretended to care about my happiness while simultaneously destroying it. I wanted to never see any of these people again. But Lily was watching me, waiting to see how I would respond to this attack. And somewhere in that crowd of strangers and fair-weather relatives, someone else was watching too. My name is Emma Richardson, and for 29 years, I've been the family disappointment. Not because I'm a bad person or because I've made terrible choices, but because I've never lived up to the image my mother and sister had of what a successful woman should be. I got pregnant at 22 with a man who disappeared the moment he learned about the baby. I dropped out of college to raise Lily, working whatever jobs I could find to keep us afloat. I've been a waitress, a retail clerk, a babysitter, and finally, a freelance graphic designer working from our tiny apartment. Victoria, meanwhile, had sailed through life collecting achievements like trophies. Perfect grades, perfect sorority, perfect job, perfect fiancé from a perfect Boston family with old money and older connections. She'd never struggled to pay rent or chosen between groceries and utilities. She'd never sat in a pediatrician's office praying that her insurance would cover her child's ear infection treatment. She'd never felt the particular exhaustion that comes from being solely responsible for another human being's everything. But she had never let me forget that she was the success story, and I was the cautionary tale. The thing is, Victoria was wrong about almost everything she'd just announced to 200 people. I wasn't still figuring things out. I wasn't still waiting for someone to see my potential. I wasn't desperately hoping that someday, maybe, if I were very lucky, someone might want me enough to propose. 2 years ago, David Chen had done exactly that. He'd gotten down on one knee in our tiny living room while Lily drew pictures at the kitchen table, and he'd asked me to marry him with tears in his eyes and a ring he'd saved for 6 months to buy. We'd gotten married 3 weeks later at the Hartford courthouse with Lily as our witness and 2 strangers as our other required attendees. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It had been small and simple and perfect. The reason nobody in my family knew about David was complicated. He was a staff sergeant in the Army, and 3 days after our wedding, he'd deployed overseas for an 18-month tour. We'd talked about announcing our marriage before he left, but I'd asked him to wait. I wanted to prove to my family, to myself, that I could be happy and successful on my own terms. I wanted to show them that I didn't need a man to validate my worth or fix my life. I wanted to announce my marriage from a position of strength, not desperation. David had understood. He'd always understood me in ways that my family never had. He'd seen past the single mother struggling to make ends meet and recognized the woman who'd built a freelance business from nothing, who'd raised an incredible daughter mostly alone, who'd survived every challenge life had thrown at her with grace and determination. He'd fallen in love with my strength, not my vulnerability. For 18 months, we'd maintained our secret marriage through video calls and emails and care packages. Lily adored him, calling him her special friend David and drawing him pictures that we mailed overseas. He'd been back for 2 months now, but I'd asked him to let me handle the family announcement in my own time, in my own way. I'd planned to tell everyone after Victoria's wedding, when the spotlight wasn't on anyone else's happiness. I should have known Victoria wouldn't let me have even that small courtesy. As she continued her toast, making jokes about spinsters and biological clocks, I scanned the crowd and found him. David sat at a table near the windows, wearing a charcoal gray suit I'd never seen before, his dark hair neatly styled, looking like he belonged among Connecticut's finest families. He'd told me he might come, that he wanted to support me even if we weren't ready to announce our relationship. He'd said he'd stay in the background, just another guest until I was ready. But as Victoria's words grew more cruel and the laughter grew more uncomfortable, I saw his jaw clench. I saw his hands tighten around his champagne glass. I saw him start to rise from his chair. Our eyes met across the crowded ballroom. In his expression, I saw 2 years of love and commitment and partnership. I saw a man who'd held me through nightmares and celebrated my small victories and treated my daughter like she was his own. I saw someone who knew my worth even when I'd forgotten it myself. I gave him the smallest nod. Permission, release, an end to our secret. Victoria was building toward her grand finale, her voice getting louder and more theatrical. So let's all raise our glasses to love in all its forms. To those who find it easily, and to those who keep searching. To those who get their fairy tale endings, and to those who, well, to those who keep hoping that someday their ship will come in. That's when David stood up. He didn't rush or make a scene. He simply rose from his chair with the quiet confidence that had first attracted me to him, straightened his jacket, and began walking toward the front of the room. Conversations started and stopped as people noticed the tall, handsome stranger moving purposefully through the crowd. Victoria faltered mid-sentence, confused by the disruption. David's voice carried clearly across the silent ballroom. "Excuse me, Victoria. I think there's been a misunderstanding." The room went completely still. Victoria blinked, her perfect composure slipping for the first time. "I'm sorry, who are you?" David smiled, the same warm smile that had convinced me to trust him with my heart and my daughter's future. "I'm David Chen, Emma's husband." The silence that followed was profound. I heard someone's champagne glass hit the floor and shatter. I heard Patricia's sharp intake of breath. I heard Michael whisper, "What?" to nobody in particular. David continued walking until he reached me, taking my trembling hand in his steady one. "We've been married for 2 years. I know it's been a secret, and that's my fault for being deployed so long, but I couldn't sit here and listen to someone talk about my wife like she's not the most incredible woman in this room." He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "Emma raised a beautiful daughter as a single mother while building her own business. She's smart, talented, compassionate, and strong. Any man would be lucky to have her, but I'm the one who gets to call her mine. I'm the one who wears her ring and shares her life and gets to watch her be an amazing mother every single day." Victoria's face had gone pale beneath her professional makeup. The microphone hung forgotten in her hand. Around the room, people were whispering, pointing, trying to process this unexpected revelation. David looked directly at my sister. "Emma didn't come here alone tonight. She came here with me, her husband, because we're a family. We've been a family for 2 years, even when I was overseas serving my country. And that little girl you just dismissed as a burden? She's one of the best things that ever happened to me." He knelt down to Lily's level, and she ran into his arms like she'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had. "Hey, sweetheart," surprise. Lily giggled and hugged him tight. "Does this mean I can call you Dad now?" "If you want to," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to," she said firmly, loud enough for the whole room to hear. I was crying now, but they were tears of relief and joy and something that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. David stood and wrapped both Lily and me in his arms, and for the first time in years, I felt completely safe and completely loved in front of my entire family. The crowd erupted in confused chatter. Some people were clapping, unsure of what else to do. Others were demanding explanations from their table mates. Patricia sat frozen at the head table, her mouth slightly open, her carefully constructed narrative about her daughter's crumbling in real time. Victoria finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous. Emma, what kind of game are you playing? If you were married, why didn't you tell anyone? Why keep it a secret?" I took the microphone from her numb fingers, my hand steady now that David was beside me. The room quieted again, waiting for my response. "I kept it a secret," I said, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom, because I wanted to prove that I was enough on my own. Because every time I've ever been happy, someone in this family has found a way to diminish it or dismiss it, or make it about what I was lacking instead of what I'd found. I wanted to be sure of myself and my marriage before I shared it with people who've spent years telling me I wasn't worthy of love. I looked directly at my mother, then at Victoria. "David has been deployed for most of our marriage, serving his country, which is why you haven't met him. But he's been part of our lives, part of Lily's life, supporting us and loving us even from thousands of miles away. He's been more of a partner to me in 2 years than some people find in a lifetime." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Victoria's carefully orchestrated moment of triumph had turned into her own humiliation. She'd publicly mocked her sister for being unloved and unmarried, only to discover that her sister had been happily married the entire time. Michael stepped forward, extending his hand to David. "Congratulations on your marriage. I'm sorry for the confusion." David shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, and congratulations on yours. I hope you'll both be very happy." It was a gracious response that made Michael look relieved, and Victoria look even more foolish by comparison. She'd spent her wedding reception attacking a woman who had exactly what she'd claimed to want, while her new husband had to apologize for her behavior. Patricia finally found her voice. "Emma, this is highly irregular. Why would you keep such important news from your family?" I met her gaze steadily. "Because this family has a habit of making my happiness about your disappointment. Because I knew that instead of celebrating with me, you'd find reasons why my marriage wasn't good enough or wasn't real enough or wasn't what you would have chosen for me. I was protecting something precious from people who've never learned how to be happy for me." The truth of it hung in the air like smoke. Around the room, people were nodding, understanding dawning on faces that had witnessed years of family dynamics played out at dinners and holidays and gatherings, just like this one. David's hand tightened around mine. "We didn't plan to announce it like this. We were going to tell everyone after the reception, privately, with respect for Victoria and Michael's special day. But when I heard someone I love being spoken about, like she was somehow less than worthy of love and respect, I couldn't stay quiet." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "This is my wedding day. You can't just show up and steal my moment with your big announcement." "I didn't steal anything," I said quietly. "You created this moment when you decided to use your wedding speech to humiliate me. All I did was tell the truth." The crowd began to disperse slowly, people returning to their conversations and their dinner courses, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. What had been Victoria's perfect fairy tale wedding had become a lesson in karma and the danger of assuming you know everything about someone's life. As the evening continued, person after person approached David and me to offer congratulations and apologies. Michael's family was particularly warm, welcoming David like they'd known him for years and making it clear that they disapproved of Victoria's behavior. Even some of my extended relatives, people who'd been cool to me for years, seemed to see me differently now that I came with a husband's validation. It was both gratifying and heartbreaking to realize how much my worth in their eyes had changed, simply because I could produce a man who'd chosen me. But the real victory wasn't in their changed perception. It was in the way Lily glowed as she introduced my dad David to anyone who would listen. It was in the way David's hand never left mine for the rest of the evening, a steady anchor in the chaos of family drama. It was in the way I finally felt free to be completely myself, secrets and shame cast off like an uncomfortable dress I'd been wearing for too long. Victoria spent the rest of her reception trying to salvage her dignity, but the damage was done. She'd revealed her own cruelty and pettiness on what should have been the happiest day of her life, while simultaneously discovering that the sister she'd spent years pitying had been living the life she claimed to want all along. As we prepared to leave that night, Patricia cornered me in the ladies' room. "Emma, I don't understand why you felt you couldn't tell us about David. We're your family." I looked at her reflection in the ornate mirror, this woman who'd raised me to believe that my worth was tied to external validation and other people's approval. "Mom, do you remember what you said when Lily was born?" She flushed slightly. "That was a long time ago. I was concerned about your future. You said I'd ruined my life. You said no decent man would ever want a woman with another man's child. You said I'd made my bed and now I'd have to lie in it, alone." The words came out steady and calm, without the anger or hurt they'd once carried. When I met David, when he fell in love with both Lily and me, when he asked me to marry him, I didn't tell you because I didn't want to hear all the reasons why it wouldn't work or wouldn't last or wasn't real. I wanted to protect my happiness from your doubt. Patricia's reflection looked smaller somehow, diminished by the truth of her own words coming back to her. "I was trying to prepare you for reality. You were trying to prepare me for your version of reality, the one where women like me don't get happy endings, but you were wrong." I turned to face her directly. I did get my happy ending. I got a man who loves me exactly as I am, who sees my daughter as a gift instead of a burden, who's been faithful and committed and present even when he was deployed thousands of miles away. I got everything you said I never would, and I got it because I stopped believing that I didn't deserve it. When we walked out of the Riverside Country Club that night, David carrying a sleeping Lily while I held his other hand, I felt like a different person than the one who'd walked in. Not because my circumstances had changed, but because I'd finally stopped hiding who I really was. The drive home was quiet, Lily curled up in her car seat clutching the small bouquet she'd caught. When Victoria threw hers with obvious reluctance, David reached over and took my hand as we wound through the Connecticut countryside. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I considered the question seriously. Was I okay? I'd just endured public humiliation from my sister, revealed a 2-year secret in the most dramatic way possible, and essentially burned bridges with family members who'd never really supported me anyway. "I'm better than okay," I said, and realized I meant it completely. "I'm free." The next morning, I woke up in our apartment with sunlight streaming through windows that no longer felt too small or too modest. David was making pancakes while Lily drew pictures at the kitchen table, both of them laughing at some private joke. It was the same apartment, the same furniture, the same life I'd been living for years. But everything felt different because I was different. My phone had dozens of missed calls and text messages, some from family members demanding explanations, others from friends and distant relatives offering congratulations and support. I turned it off and left it in the bedroom. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel obligated to manage other people's emotions about my choices. David brought me coffee and sat down beside me at our little kitchen table. "Any regrets about last night?" I shook my head. "The only regret I have is that we waited so long to tell people, not because I needed their approval or validation, but because you deserve to be acknowledged. Lily deserved to call you dad in public. I deserved to stop pretending that my happiness was something to be ashamed of." He smiled and kissed my forehead. "We did it in our own time, in our own way, That's what matters. Lily looked up from her drawing. Are we going to have a real wedding party now? With cake and dancing? David and I exchanged glances. We'd talked about renewing our vows when he returned from deployment, having the celebration we'd skipped the first time around. Now it seemed like the perfect way to mark not just our marriage, but our decision to live openly and authentically. Would you like that? I asked her. Yes, and I want to wear a fancy dress and be your flower girl and dance with Dad and eat lots of cake. Then that's what we'll do, David said solemnly. We'll have the biggest, most beautiful celebration, and we'll invite everyone who's ever made your mom feel loved and supported. As I looked around our small apartment at my husband making breakfast and my daughter planning our future celebration, I realized that Victoria had been wrong about everything. I hadn't been waiting for my ship to come in. I hadn't been hoping for someone to finally see my worth. I'd been building a life and a family and a love story that was entirely my own. And I'd been doing it with more courage and authenticity than anyone in that ballroom had given me credit for. The fairy tale wasn't in the designer dress, or the expensive venue, or the 200 guests bearing witness. The fairy tale was in choosing love over fear, truth over pretense, and authenticity over approval. It was in the quiet moments of real partnership and the daily choice to build something beautiful together, even when nobody was watching. That morning, as we planned our vow renewal and Lily drew pictures of wedding cakes, I finally understood what my mother and sister had never learned. True worth doesn't come from other people's recognition or validation. It comes from knowing yourself, honoring your truth, and surrounding yourself with people who see and celebrate the real you. I'd been enough all along. I just needed to stop waiting for permission to believe it. The morning after Victoria's wedding, I woke to 17 missed calls from my mother and a text message that simply read, "We need to talk. Now." I deleted it without reading the rest and turned my phone face down on the nightstand. David was already up, making coffee in our small kitchen, while Lily sat at the table eating cereal and humming quietly to herself. The normalcy of it felt surreal after the chaos of the previous evening. "How are you feeling?" David asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I stood in the doorway watching our daughter. "Like I can breathe for the first time in years," I admitted, and terrified of what comes next. He kissed the top of my head. "What comes next is whatever we decide comes next. Nobody else gets a vote anymore." The phone rang again. This time it was Victoria, calling from what I assumed was her honeymoon suite. I let it go to voicemail, then another call from my Aunt Rebecca, then my cousin Jennifer. By noon, it seemed like every member of my extended family had something urgent to say about the previous night's revelations. I finally answered when my Uncle Tom called. He'd always been the gentlest member of our family, the one who remembered birthdays and asked about Lily's school projects during holiday gatherings. "Emma, honey, I just wanted to say congratulations," he said, his voice warm and sincere. "I had no idea you'd gotten married, but that young man of yours seems like good people. The way he stood up for you last night took real character." I felt tears prick my eyes. "Thank you, Uncle Tom. That means everything." "Your Aunt Susan and I were talking, and we think maybe it's time this family learned how to celebrate each other instead of always looking for what's wrong. You've done a beautiful job raising Lily, and if you found someone who makes you happy, well, that's cause for celebration, not criticism." After I hung up, David found me crying at the kitchen table. Good tears or bad tears? Good tears. Uncle Tom called to congratulate us. He said David seems like good people. Smart man, your uncle. But not everyone in the family shared Uncle Tom's perspective. Over the next few days, the reactions poured in like a mixed bag of confessions and accusations. Some relatives expressed genuine happiness for us, admitting they'd always thought I deserved better treatment from Victoria and Patricia. Others demanded explanations for the deception, as if I owed them transparency about every aspect of my personal life. The most telling response came from my mother's sister, Aunt Margaret, who called 3 days after the wedding to deliver what she probably thought was helpful advice. "Emma, dear, I understand why you kept the marriage secret, but don't you think it was a bit cruel to let Victoria make such a spectacle of herself? If you'd just told everyone beforehand, none of this would have happened." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, staring at it in disbelief. "Aunt Margaret, Victoria chose to use her wedding reception to publicly humiliate me. The fact that she was wrong about my personal life doesn't make her behavior any less cruel." "Well, yes, but you have to understand how it looked. Poor Victoria thought she was trying to include you, and then to find out you've been married all along, well, it made her look foolish. She made herself look foolish by assuming she knew everything about my life, and using that assumption to hurt me in front of 200 people. That's not my fault or my responsibility." There was a long pause. "You've always been so sensitive, Emma. Victoria was just trying to acknowledge you during her speech." I hung up without saying goodbye. David found me pacing the living room. Afterward, too angry to sit still. "Let me guess," he said. "Someone just explained to you how you're actually the villain in this story?" "Aunt Margaret thinks I should have prevented Victoria from embarrassing herself by being more forthcoming. About our marriage? Apparently, the real tragedy here is that Victoria looked foolish, not that she spent 5 minutes destroying me in front of everyone we know." David pulled me down onto the couch beside him. "You know what I think? I think your family has spent so many years making you responsible for everyone else's feelings that they can't imagine a world where you're not the one who has to fix everything." He was right, and the truth of it settled over me like a heavy blanket. For as long as I could remember, I'd been the family's emotional caretaker, the one expected to absorb criticism gracefully and smooth over conflicts. When Victoria was in high school and got caught cheating on a test, somehow I was the one who got lectured about being a better role model for my younger sister. When she went through a rebellious phase in college and came home with a nose ring and an attitude, I was the one Patricia called to complain to, as if I was responsible for managing Victoria's choices. Even my decision to keep my marriage private had been, in part, about protecting my family from having to confront their own assumptions about my worth. I'd known that announcing my happiness would force them to acknowledge that they'd been wrong about me, and I'd wanted to spare them that discomfort. The irony wasn't lost on me that even my secrecy had been a form of caretaking. That evening, while David helped Lily with her homework, I sat down at my laptop and did something I'd never done before. I wrote a letter to my family. Not an explanation or an apology, but a boundary. "To my family," I began, then deleted it and started over. "To those who've been asking for explanations about my marriage." I spent 2 hours crafting the email, deleting and rewriting paragraphs, trying to strike the right tone between firmness and kindness. Finally, I settled on something simple and direct. "I've received many calls and messages asking why David and I kept our marriage private for 2 years. I understand that some of you feel hurt or confused by our decision, and I want to address that once, for everyone. David and I married 2 years ago during his leave, just before he deployed overseas. We kept our marriage private because I wanted to establish our relationship on our own terms, without outside input or judgment. I wanted to prove to myself that I could be happy and successful independently, while also building a partnership based on mutual respect and love. I also kept our marriage private because I've learned, over many years, that sharing my happiness with this family often results in criticism, doubt, or attempts to diminish what I've found. I wasn't willing to subject my marriage or my husband to that treatment. What happened at Victoria's wedding was not planned. We had intended to announce our marriage privately after the celebration, out of respect for Victoria and Michael's special day. When David heard me being publicly humiliated, he made a choice to defend his wife and stepdaughter. I support that choice completely. I'm not sorry for protecting my happiness. I'm not sorry for choosing a partner who values and defends me. I'm not sorry for building a life that works for my family, even if others don't understand or approve of it. Going forward, David, Lily, and I will be happy to maintain relationships with family members who can celebrate our happiness and treat us with respect. We're not interested in defending our choices or managing other people's feelings about our decisions. With love and boundaries, Emma. I read it 3 times before hitting send, copying everyone who'd reached out over the past few days. Then I closed the laptop and felt something shift inside my chest, like a door closing on an old room I'd been trying to clean for years. David looked up from where he was helping Lily sound out vocabulary words. Everything okay? Better than okay. I just sent the last explanation I'm ever going to give about our choices. Within an hour, the responses started coming in. Uncle Tom wrote back immediately with a simple, "Good for you, honey. Love you all." A few cousins expressed support and understanding. My Aunt Rebecca admitted she'd always thought I deserved better treatment and was glad I'd found happiness. But the radio silence from Patricia and Victoria spoke volumes. No response often said more than any words could. 2 weeks later, I was loading groceries into my car outside the Hartford Whole Foods when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Emma? Emma Richardson? I turned to find Sarah Mitchell, a woman I'd known peripherally through Victoria's social circle. She'd been at the wedding, seated somewhere in the middle section with other young professionals from Victoria's marketing firm. "Hi, Sarah, how are you?" She looked genuinely pleased to see me, which surprised me given our limited interaction over the years. "I'm well, thank you. I hope you don't mind me saying, but I wanted to tell you how impressed I was by your husband at Victoria's wedding. That took real class, the way he handled that situation." I felt warmth spread through my chest. "Thank you. I'm pretty proud of him too. I have to admit, a lot of us at the office have been talking about it. Victoria's she's been struggling a bit since she got back from her honeymoon. I think she's realizing that maybe her speech didn't come across the way she intended." This was news to me. I hadn't spoken to Victoria since the wedding, despite several voicemails that I'd deleted without listening to completely. Sarah continued, "The thing is, most of us have always wondered how she could talk about you the way she did. We've met you at company parties over the years, and you've always been so kind and genuine. When we found out you'd been married this whole time and had just been, quietly living your life without needing to broadcast every detail, it made a lot of sense. Some of us wish we had your confidence." It was one of those conversations that stays with you, not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed. Victoria's colleagues, people I'd assumed shared her opinion of me, had actually been questioning her treatment of her own sister. The narrative she'd constructed about my failures and her successes hadn't been as convincing to others as it had been to her. That evening, I shared the encounter with David while we cooked dinner. Together, Lily was in the living room, building an elaborate fort out of couch cushions and blankets. "It's interesting," David said, chopping vegetables for our stir-fry. "Victoria spent so much energy trying to prove she was better than you that she never stopped to consider how her behavior reflected on her own character. I think she genuinely believed she was helping me somehow. Like pointing out my failures publicly would motivate me to do better. That's not help. That's sabotage dressed up as concern." He was right, but it had taken me years to see the difference. Growing up, Victoria's criticism had often been presented as sisterly advice or tough love. She'd tell me my clothes were unflattering because she cared about how I presented myself. She'd comment on my weight because she wanted me to be healthy. She'd question my parenting choices because she wanted what was best for Lily. It had taken meeting David to understand what actual support looked like. When he offered suggestions, they came with kindness and respect for my autonomy. When he disagreed with my decisions, he expressed his concerns without attacking my character or competence. When he wanted to help, he asked what I needed rather than assuming he knew better than I did about my own life. The contrast had been jarring at first. I'd been so accustomed to criticism wrapped in concern that David's straightforward affection and respect had felt almost foreign. It had taken months of his consistent behavior for me to trust that he wasn't keeping score of my mistakes or waiting for me to prove my worthiness of his love. A month after the wedding, Victoria finally called. I was folding laundry while Lily played in her room and David worked in his small home office, handling veteran services paperwork for other former soldiers. The domestic tranquility of the moment made Victoria's timing feel particularly intrusive. Emma, we need to talk. No, hello, no, how are you? Just a demand for my attention and time. It was so typically Victoria that I almost smiled. What did you want to talk about, Victoria? About what happened at my wedding. About this whole situation you've created. I set down the towel I'd been folding and took a deep breath. I didn't create any situation, Victoria. You used your wedding reception to publicly humiliate me, and when my husband defended me, the truth came out. That's not a situation I created. That's a consequence of choices you made. You let me make a fool of myself. You sat there and let me talk about your pathetic love life when you've been married the whole time. The accusation was so absurd that I laughed, which clearly wasn't the response she'd expected. Victoria, you made a fool of yourself by assuming you knew everything about my private life and using those assumptions to hurt me in front of 200 people. The fact that you were wrong about the details doesn't change the cruelty of what you did. I was trying to include you in my speech. I was acknowledging that you were there. By calling me a cautionary tale? By suggesting that I was desperate and pathetic and would probably never find love? That's not inclusion, Victoria. That's humiliation. There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its defensive edge. I didn't mean it to sound that harsh, but it did sound that harsh. And even if you'd meant it kindly, even if you genuinely thought you were being supportive, you made assumptions about my life without asking me about my reality. You decided what my story was and announced it to everyone we know without bothering, to check if you were right. So what was I supposed to do? Ask you if you were secretly married before giving my wedding speech? You were supposed to not use your wedding speech to comment on my personal life at all. You were supposed to talk about your love for Michael, your gratitude to your guests, your hopes for your future. You weren't supposed to use the opportunity to compare yourself to me or point out what you perceived as my failures. Another pause. Mom says you're being overdramatic about this. Of course she did. Patricia had built her entire relationship with both of her daughters on the foundation of Victoria's superiority and my inadequacy. Acknowledging that Victoria had behaved badly would require acknowledging that their whole family dynamic was toxic. Mom wasn't the one who got humiliated in front of 200 people, Victoria. Her opinion about my reaction isn't really relevant. Fine. I'm sorry if my speech hurt your feelings, but I still don't understand why you kept your marriage a secret. Don't you think we deserve to know? The question revealed so much about Victoria's worldview. She genuinely believed that she was entitled to information about my private life, that my choices somehow belonged to her and the rest of the family to evaluate and approve. Victoria, the only people who deserved to know about my marriage were David, Lily, and me. Everyone else gets to know what we choose to share, when we choose to share it. That's how healthy relationships work. We're family. Being family doesn't give you unlimited access to my private life. Being family doesn't mean I owe you explanations for my choices. Being family should mean that you trust me to make good decisions and support me even when you don't understand everything I'm doing. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, processing this perspective that was clearly foreign to her understanding of family obligations. I just don't understand why you didn't trust us enough to tell us. For a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy for her. She sounded genuinely confused, as if she couldn't fathom why someone might want to protect their happiness from family scrutiny. Victoria, think about how you reacted when you found out I was married. Your first response wasn't congratulations. or happiness for me. It was anger that I hadn't told you sooner. Your second response was to blame me for letting you embarrass yourself. Even now, in this conversation, you haven't once expressed joy about my happiness or welcomed David to the family. Every single response has been about how my choices affected you. That's not fair. It's completely fair, and it's exactly why I didn't tell you. Because I knew that sharing my happiness with this family would somehow become about everyone else's feelings and opinions, instead of being about my joy. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it became clear that Victoria wasn't calling to apologize or repair our relationship. She was calling to get me to apologize for embarrassing her and to promise that I'd handle family communication differently in the future. When I finally hung up, I felt drained, but also relieved. The conversation had confirmed what I'd already suspected, that Victoria wasn't capable of taking responsibility for her behavior or examining her role in our family dysfunction. More importantly, it had confirmed that I was ready to stop trying to manage her emotions or fix our relationship. David appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, having clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand how it had gone. "How do you feel?" he asked, settling beside me on the couch. "Sad," I admitted, but not guilty. For the first time in my life, I'm sad about Victoria without feeling like it's my job to fix whatever's broken between us. That's progress. It is. It's also terrifying. If I'm not responsible for everyone else's feelings, if I'm not the family peacekeeper, who am I? David set down his tea and took my hands in his. "You're a woman who's been carrying everyone else's emotional baggage for so long that you forgot. You don't have to. You're someone who deserves to be loved and supported without having to earn it by being perfect. You're my wife, Lily's mother, and a person worthy of respect and kindness just because you exist." That night, as I lay in bed listening to David's steady breathing beside me, I thought about the woman I'd been before his love had shown me a different way to exist in the world. I'd been so focused on being good enough, worthy enough, helpful enough to earn my family's approval that I'd lost sight of my own needs and desires. Meeting David had been the beginning of my recovery from that mindset, but the wedding had been the moment I'd finally chosen myself over their comfort. For the first time in my life, I'd prioritized my own truth over their narrative about who I was supposed to be. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Without the familiar weight of other people's expectations and disappointments, I felt lighter, but also unmoored. Who was I when I wasn't constantly trying to prove my worth? What did I want when I wasn't focused on what other people thought I should want? These were questions I'd never had the luxury of exploring, and as I drifted off to sleep, I felt excited about the possibility of discovering the answers. The autumn air carried a crisp promise of winter as I walked through downtown Hartford with Lily after her piano lesson. She'd been taking lessons for 6 months now, something we could finally afford with David's steady income supplementing my freelance work. Her small fingers were getting stronger each week, and today she'd played through Für Elise without a single mistake. The pride in her eyes had been worth every dollar we'd spent on the old upright piano we'd found at an estate sale. "Mom, can we get hot chocolate?" Lily asked, tugging on my hand as we passed the small cafe where David and I had our first official date 3 years ago. He'd been nervous that day, worried that a 7-year-old might not approve of her mother's new boyfriend. Lily had won him over within minutes by asking if he knew any card tricks, and then proceeding to show him 3 she'd learned from a library book. "Of course, sweetheart. David's picking us up in 20 minutes, so we have time." The cafe was warm and smelled like cinnamon and coffee beans. Lily chatted excitedly about the Christmas recital her piano teacher was planning while I ordered our drinks. It was one of those perfect, ordinary moments that had become precious to me since the Riverside wedding 3 months ago. Before David's public declaration, I'd lived with a constant undercurrent of anxiety about my family's judgment and disappointment. Now, free from the weight of their expectations, every small joy felt amplified. We'd just settled into a corner booth when I saw her. Patricia Richardson walked through the cafe door, scanning the interior with the same calculating expression she'd worn at charity galas and parent-teacher conferences throughout my childhood. She was alone, dressed in her signature style of expensive neutrals that suggested sophistication without ostentation. When her eyes found mine, she hesitated for just a moment before approaching our table. "Emma? Lily?" Her voice carried the formal politeness she reserved for acquaintances rather than family. "Grandma Patricia!" Lily's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Despite everything that had happened between the adults in our family, she'd maintained her innocent affection for her grandmother. Children have a remarkable ability to love unconditionally, even when that love isn't consistently returned. Patricia's expression softened slightly as she looked at her granddaughter. "Hello, sweetheart. How are your piano lessons going?" "Really good. I can play a whole song now without messing up. Do you want to hear it? I can sing it for you." "That would be lovely, but maybe another time. I was actually hoping to speak with your mother." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that always accompanied interactions with Patricia. But it was different now. Less anticipatory dread and more resigned wariness. I'd spent so many years trying to earn her approval that facing her, disappointment had become a conditioned response. But 3 months of living authentically had begun to rewire those old patterns. "What did you want to discuss?" I asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from us. Patricia sat down carefully, arranging her purse and coat with the precise movements of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of public composure. "I think it's time we talked about what happened at Victoria's wedding." Lily looked between us with the intuitive awareness that children develop when they live in complicated family dynamics. "Should I go get my coloring book from your purse, Mom?" "That's a good idea, honey. Color at the next table so we can still see each other." After Lily had moved to a nearby table with her art supplies, Patricia leaned forward slightly. "Emma, I owe you an apology." The words were so unexpected that I wasn't sure I'd heard them correctly. In 29 years, I could count on one hand the number of times Patricia Richardson had admitted to being wrong about anything, and most of those instances had involved factual errors rather than matters of judgment or behavior. "I've spent the last 3 months thinking about that night," she continued, her voice quieter than usual. "About Victoria's speech, about your response, about everything that's happened since. I've talked to several people who were there, and I've come to realize that my perspective on the situation was limited. I waited, unsure how to respond. Years of experience had taught me to be wary of Patricia's moments of apparent vulnerability. They often preceded lectures about my failings or requests for me to be more understanding of Victoria's perspective. Your Uncle Tom was quite direct with me last week. He said some things that were difficult to hear but probably necessary. He reminded me of comments I've made over the years about your choices, about Lily, about your prospects for happiness. He suggested that perhaps you had good reasons for keeping your marriage private." Patricia paused, looking out the cafe, window at the pedestrians hurrying past in the late afternoon light. "I've always prided myself on being supportive of my daughters, but I'm beginning to understand that support and criticism aren't the same thing, even when the criticism is well-intentioned." "What made you want to have this conversation now?" I asked. "Victoria's been struggling since the wedding. Her marriage is fine, but she's been having trouble at work, problems with friends. She's realized that people heard her speech differently than she intended, and it's forced her to examine some uncomfortable truths about herself. About both of us, really." This was information I hadn't expected. Since our phone conversation, a month ago, I'd assumed Victoria was continuing her life as usual, perhaps with some wounded pride but no real self-reflection. The idea that she might be experiencing genuine consequences for her behavior was both surprising and, if I was honest, somewhat satisfying. "I've also been thinking about David," Patricia continued. about the way he handled himself that night, the way he defended you and Lily, the respect he showed even while disagreeing with Victoria's behavior. I realize I never welcomed him to the family or acknowledged what he means to you and Lily. She looked directly at me for the first time since sitting down. I'd like to remedy that, if you're willing. The conversation felt surreal. For 3 decades, Patricia had maintained strict control over family narratives and relationships. She'd determined who was successful and who was struggling, who deserved praise and who needed correction. The idea that she might be ready to relinquish some of that control, to admit that her judgments might have been flawed, seemed almost impossible. What would that look like? I asked carefully. I'd like to invite you, David, and Lily for Sunday dinner. A proper introduction. A chance for me to get to know my son-in-law without all the drama and assumptions. A chance for me to be the kind of grandmother Lily deserves. I glanced over at my daughter, who was carefully coloring a rainbow with intense concentration. She'd grown up with sporadic attention from her grandmother, affection that seemed contingent on my behavior, and Patricia's mood. The possibility of a more stable, loving relationship with her grandmother was appealing, but I'd learned to be cautious about Patricia's promises of change. I appreciate the invitation, I said slowly, but I need to be clear about something. If we come to dinner, if we try to rebuild this relationship, it has to be based on acceptance of who we are, not hopes for who you think we should become. David and I are happy with our life. We're not looking for approval or advice or suggestions for improvement. We're looking for family who can love us as we are. Patricia nodded, though I could see the effort it took for her to resist the urge, to qualify or explain. I understand, and I want to try. The words hung between us, carrying the weight of 3 decades of complicated history. I found myself thinking about forgiveness, about the difference between accepting an apology and trusting that real change was possible. Patricia's willingness to admit fault was unprecedented, but it would take time and consistent behavior to prove that her new perspective was genuine rather than temporary. Let me talk to David about it, I said finally, and we'll see how Sunday works. After Patricia left, Lily returned to our table with her completed rainbow. Is Grandma Patricia sad about something? She's trying to figure some things out, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have to learn new ways of being with each other. Like how I had to learn to play piano with both hands instead of just one. Exactly like that. It takes practice to get it right. When David arrived to pick us up, I told him about the encounter as we drove home through the early evening traffic. Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat, exhausted from her busy day, and the car felt cocooned in domestic tranquility. What's your gut feeling about it? David asked. Cautiously optimistic, I think. She seemed genuinely reflective, not just strategically apologetic. But Patricia's very good at saying what she thinks people want to hear when it serves her purposes. And what would you want from a relationship with her going forward? It was such a David question, cutting straight to the heart of what mattered. He'd learned early in our relationship that I had a tendency to get lost in other people's needs and expectations, and he'd made it his mission to help me stay connected to my own desires and boundaries. I want Lily to have a grandmother who loves her unconditionally. I want to not feel like I'm being evaluated every time we interact. I want to be able to share good news without waiting for criticism or suggestions for how it could be better. Those seem like reasonable things to want. They do. The question is whether Patricia is capable of providing them. That evening, after Lily was in bed, David and I sat in our small living room discussing the dinner invitation. The autumn evening was cool enough for our first fire of the season, and the crackling logs created a sense of warmth and safety that made difficult conversations feel more manageable. I think we should go, David said, surprising me. Not because I think Patricia has definitely changed, but because you'll never know if you don't give her the chance to prove it. What if she reverts to her old patterns? What if she criticizes our parenting or our house or our choices? Then we leave. We thank her for dinner. We leave, and we don't accept another invitation. But if she's genuinely trying to change, if she's capable of treating us with respect, isn't that worth exploring? I leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his steady presence. When did you become so wise about family dynamics? When I fell in love with someone whose family had convinced her she wasn't worthy of love. I've had a lot of motivation to figure out how healthy relationships work. The following Sunday, we drove to Patricia's house in West Hartford, the colonial where I'd grown up but hadn't visited in over 2 years. The house looked exactly the same, all pristine landscaping and coordinated window treatments, but I felt different approaching it. Instead of the familiar anxiety about meeting expectations, I felt curious about whether this visit would be different from all the others. Patricia answered the door wearing a casual sweater and slacks instead of her usual formal attire. "Emma, David, Lily, please come in. I'm so glad you could make it." She led us into the living room where she'd set out photo albums on the coffee table. I thought David might enjoy seeing some pictures of Emma growing up. And Lily, I found some photos of you from last Christmas that I thought you'd like to see. It was a thoughtful gesture, the kind of thing a welcoming mother-in-law might do to help a new family member feel included. David settled onto the couch beside me, genuinely interested in the photographs, while Lily climbed onto Patricia's lap to look at pictures of herself. "You were such a serious little girl," Patricia said, showing David a photo of me at age 7, reading in the garden. Always had a book in her hands. I used to worry that she spent too much time alone. "She still loves to read," David said. "I catch her up until midnight with novels all the time." "And you don't mind?" "Why would I mind? She works hard all day. She takes care of all of us. If she wants to spend her free time reading, that's her choice." It was such a simple exchange, but it revealed the fundamental difference between David's approach to our relationship and my family's historical approach. David saw my choices as mine to make, while Patricia had always seen them as problems to be solved or behaviors to be corrected. The conversation flowed more naturally than I'd expected as we looked through albums spanning my childhood and adolescence. Patricia shared stories I'd never heard about my father, who died when I was 25, and seemed genuinely interested in David's military service and his work with veterans. When we moved to the dining room for dinner, Patricia had prepared all of my favorite foods from childhood. The roast chicken was perfectly seasoned, the mashed potatoes were made with real butter and cream, and she'd even made the green bean casserole I'd loved as a child but hadn't eaten in years. "This is delicious, Mrs. Richardson," David said, and I saw Patricia's pleased expression at the compliment. "Please, call me Patricia. Or Mom, if you're comfortable with that. You're family now." The offer was extended simply, without fanfare or conditions, and I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen. David smiled and nodded his acceptance, and I realized that this was what I'd wanted for years without knowing how to ask for it. Not just tolerance of my choices, but genuine welcome for the people I loved. Dinner conversations centered around Lily's piano progress, David's work, and my recent freelance projects. Patricia asked questions that seemed motivated by genuine interest rather than hidden criticism. She complimented a logo design I'd created for a local nonprofit and asked thoughtful questions about David's plans for completing his bachelor's degree. It wasn't until we were clearing the table that she brought up Victoria. "I want you to know that Victoria would like to reach out to you," Patricia said carefully. "She's been doing some thinking since the wedding, and I believe she's ready to have a real conversation about what happened." I paused in stacking plates, considering how to respond. I'm not opposed to talking to Victoria, but I need her to understand that I'm not looking for explanations or justifications for her behavior. If she wants to apologize and work on rebuilding our relationship, I'm open to that. But I'm not interested in relitigating who was right or wrong. I think she understands that now. It's taken her some time to see the situation clearly, but She's getting there. After dinner, while Lily played piano for her grandmother and David examined the vintage military photographs in Patricia's study, I found myself washing dishes in the kitchen where I'd spent countless hours as a child. The familiar ritual of washing and drying, the view of the backyard through the window above the sink, the sound of my daughter's music drifting from the living room, all combined to create a sense of continuity that I hadn't expected to find comforting. Patricia joined me at the sink, drying dishes as I washed them. "I've missed this," she said quietly. "Having you in the house, hearing Lily's laughter. I've missed being part of your daily life." "I've missed it too," I admitted, surprised by the truth of the statement. But I couldn't keep subjecting myself and Lily to constant criticism. It was too damaging. "I know. I understand that now. I thought I was helping you make better choices, but I was really just making you feel terrible about the choices you'd already made. That's not love. That's not support." We worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the rhythm of washing and drying creating space for reflection. I found myself thinking about the years of distance between us, about the holidays and birthdays and ordinary Sundays we'd missed because I couldn't bear another encounter that left me feeling diminished. "Patricia," I said, using her name deliberately. "If we're going to try to rebuild this relationship, I need you to understand that David and I make decisions together about our family. We don't need advice or suggestions unless we ask for them. We need support and acceptance. I understand, and I want to learn how to do that better." The evening ended with plans for Patricia to attend Lily's Christmas piano recital and a tentative invitation for us to join the extended family for Thanksgiving. As we drove home through the suburban streets lined with houses preparing for winter, I felt cautiously hopeful about the possibility of a healthier relationship with my mother. "How do you feel about tonight?" David asked as we tucked Lily into bed. Surprised, cautiously optimistic, still a little guarded, but hopeful. She seemed genuine to me, different from how you've described her in the past. She was different. The question is whether this is temporary behavior motivated by guilt or a real shift in how she wants to relate to us. Over the following weeks, Patricia made consistent efforts to maintain the new dynamic we'd established. She called to check on us without offering unsolicited advice. She sent Lily care packages with art supplies and books, always including thoughtful notes about her granddaughter's interests and accomplishments. She invited David to join her at a veterans charity fundraiser, introducing him proudly to her friends as her son-in-law. Most significantly, she didn't push for immediate reconciliation with Victoria. When I mentioned that I wasn't ready for that conversation, Patricia accepted my timeline without argument or manipulation. She seemed to understand that trust had to be rebuilt gradually, through consistent actions rather than grand gestures. The real test came in mid-November, when Victoria called me directly for the first time since our confrontational conversation months earlier. Her voice was different, quieter and less certain than I'd ever heard it. "Emma, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I was hoping we could meet for coffee. I have some things I need to say to you, and I think they need to be said in person." I'd been expecting this call since Patricia mentioned Victoria's desire to reconcile, but I still felt my stomach tighten with apprehension. "What kind of things?" An apology, a real one, not the half-hearted thing I offered before. And maybe a chance to explain where my head was during all those years when I was so awful to you. "I'm not looking for explanations, Victoria. I'm looking for acknowledgement of the impact your behavior had on me and assurance that it won't continue." "I understand, and I think I can give you both of those things now." We agreed to meet at a neutral cafe downtown, somewhere neither of us had history or baggage attached to the location. I asked David if he wanted to come for moral support, but he encouraged me to handle the conversation on my own terms. "You don't need me to validate your perspective or defend you," he said. "You know your own truth now. Trust that." The morning of our meeting, I dressed carefully in clothes that made me feel confident and comfortable. I'd learned that feeling good about my appearance helped me feel more centered in difficult conversations. I arrived at the cafe a few minutes early, choosing a table near the window where I could see Victoria approaching. She looked different when she walked through the door, still polished and well-dressed, but there was something less rigid about her posture, less performative about her presence. She'd lost weight, and there were shadows under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I wasn't sure you would. I'm here because I believe people can change, and because I want to believe you're capable of treating me better than you have in the past." Victoria nodded, fidgeting with her coffee cup. "I've been seeing a therapist since the wedding. It took Michael threatening to leave me for me to finally admit that maybe the problem wasn't everyone else's sensitivity to my honesty." This was unexpected information. Victoria had always prided herself on being too mentally healthy to need professional help, viewing therapy as something for people who couldn't handle their problems independently. "What have you learned?" "That I've been a terrible sister to you for most of our lives. That I used you as a scapegoat for my own insecurities. That I convinced myself I was helping you when I was really just making myself feel better about my own choices." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been practicing them. "I was so afraid of not being perfect, of not being the successful daughter Mom wanted, that I made you into the failure so I could be the success. Every time I pointed out your problems or your struggles, I was really just reassuring myself that I was doing everything right." She looked directly at me for the first time since sitting down. "I turned you into my cautionary tale because I was terrified of becoming one myself." The honesty was startling. Victoria had never been vulnerable with me, never admitted weakness or uncertainty. Seeing her stripped of her usual confidence was both satisfying and uncomfortable. "The wedding speech was the worst version of that pattern," she continued. "I was so nervous about being the center of attention, about living up to everyone's expectations for the perfect bride, that I decided to make sure everyone knew how much better my life was than yours. It was cruel and unnecessary, and I'm ashamed of myself." "It was cruel," I agreed, "but it was also revealing. It showed everyone who you really are when you feel threatened or insecure." Victoria flinched but didn't argue. "I know. And I understand if you don't want to forgive me or try to rebuild our relationship. I understand if you think it's too late for us." I sipped my coffee, considering her words and my own feelings. The apology felt genuine, but apologies were easy compared to changed behavior. The real question was whether Victoria was capable of relating to me differently going forward. "If we're going to try to rebuild our relationship," I said finally, "it has to be based on equality and respect. I'm not interested in being your project or your cautionary tale or your inspiration. I'm interested in being your sister." "I want that too. I want to know who you really are, not the version of you I created to make myself feel better." We talked for 2 hours, covering ground we'd never explored in 3 decades of sisterhood. Victoria shared her struggles with perfectionism and her fear of disappointing our mother. I talked about the years of feeling invisible and inadequate, about the impact her criticism had on my self-worth. Neither of us tried to minimize the pain we'd caused or received, but we began to see each other as complex people rather than simple characters in our family drama. The conversation didn't solve everything, but it opened a door that had been closed for years. As we prepared to leave, Victoria made a request that surprised me. "I'd like to meet David properly. As your husband is part of our family, I'd like to apologize to him for my behavior and welcome him the way I should have from the beginning." "I think that could be arranged," I said carefully. "But Victoria, this has to be real. If you revert to your old patterns, if you start criticizing or comparing or competing, I'm done. I won't put myself or my family through that again. I understand, and I won't. I can't promise I'll be perfect at this new way of being sisters, but I can promise I'll keep trying to do better. Walking back to my car after our conversation, I felt cautiously hopeful about the possibility of a genuine relationship with Victoria for the first time in years. The apology had felt authentic, and her willingness to examine her own behavior suggested a level of self-awareness I hadn't seen from her before. That evening, I shared the details of our conversation with David while we prepared dinner together. Lily was at a friend's house for a sleepover, giving us rare, uninterrupted time to process the day's events. "How do you feel about it?" David asked, chopping vegetables for our stir-fry. "Hopeful but realistic. Victoria said all the right things, but she said nice things before, and then reverted to her old behavior when it suited her. The real test will be whether she can maintain this new approach over time. And if she can't, then I'll know I tried, and I can move forward without regret. But if she can, if she's really capable of change, then maybe we can have the kind of sisterhood I always wanted." The possibility felt both exciting and terrifying. For so many years, I'd protected myself from Victoria's judgment by maintaining emotional distance. Opening myself to the possibility of a real relationship with her meant accepting the risk of being hurt again. But it also meant the potential for healing wounds that had shaped my understanding of family and belonging for most of my life. As we sat down to dinner, David raised his glass of wine in a toast to new beginnings and the courage to hope for better. I clinked my glass against his, feeling grateful for his unwavering support and his faith in my ability to navigate complicated relationships with wisdom and strength. Whatever happened with Victoria and Patricia going forward, I knew I had a foundation of love and acceptance that would sustain me through any challenges that arose. For the first time in my adult life, I was approaching family relationships from a position of strength rather than neediness, confidence rather than desperation. I was no longer the woman who would accept crumbs of affection in exchange for tolerating mistreatment. I was someone who knew her own worth and insisted that others recognize it too. The transformation felt complete, but I was beginning to understand that it was really just the beginning of a new way of being in the world, a way that prioritized authenticity over approval, boundaries over accommodation, and self-respect over keeping the peace. It was a way of living that honored both my own needs and my capacity for love, forgiveness, and growth. Spring arrived early that year, filling our Hartford apartment with golden light that transformed even our modest living room into something magical. Lily was practicing for her spring piano recital, her small fingers dancing across the keys, with confidence that had grown exponentially over the past 6 months. The melody of Chopin's Minute Waltz floated through the apartment, mixing with the scent of the cherry blossoms blooming outside our windows and the rich aroma of David's coffee brewing in the kitchen. I sat at my desk in the corner of the living room, putting finishing touches on a logo design for a sustainable fashion startup. My freelance business had grown steadily since the wedding 8 months ago, partly due to word-of-mouth referrals, but mostly because I'd finally learned to value my own work appropriately. No more undercharging because I was grateful for any client who would hire me. No more accepting impossible deadlines because I was afraid to lose business. I'd discovered that respecting my own expertise made others respect it too. David emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 steaming mugs, setting one beside my laptop before settling onto the couch with his own. He was reviewing applications for the veteran services nonprofit he'd started 3 months ago, a dream he'd carried since his deployment, but hadn't felt confident pursuing until our family life stabilized. Watching him build something meaningful from his passion for helping other veterans had been one of the most rewarding aspects of our first year of public marriage. "The Hendersons confirmed for Saturday," he said, referring to the vow renewal ceremony we'd planned for our 3-year wedding anniversary. Unlike our courthouse ceremony years ago, this celebration would include everyone who mattered to us. Not because we needed validation from others, but because we'd finally found people. worthy of sharing our joy. How many does that make total? 43. Small enough to feel intimate, large enough to include everyone who's been genuinely supportive. The guest list had been one of the most revealing aspects of planning this celebration. When we'd started making invitations, I'd realized how dramatically my definition of family had expanded over the past year. Uncle Tom and Aunt Susan were coming, along with several cousins who'd reached out after the wedding to express their support. David's military friends and their families would be there, people who'd become like siblings to us through shared experiences and mutual respect. Most surprisingly, Patricia would be attending, and she'd volunteered to help with decorations. Her transformation over the past months had been gradual but consistent. She'd learned to ask before offering advice, to listen without immediately trying to fix or improve whatever I shared with her. More importantly, she'd developed a genuine relationship with David based on respect rather than polite tolerance, and her bond with Lily had deepened into something warm and unconditional. Victoria would also be there, along with Michael, who'd become an unexpected ally in our family's healing process. Their marriage had weathered the storm of Victoria's post-wedding self-examination, emerging stronger as she'd learned to address her insecurities directly rather than projecting them onto others. She'd even started therapy with Michael, working together on communication patterns that had been damaging their relationship in ways neither had fully recognized. The biggest surprise on our guest list was someone who wouldn't be attending, but whose absence felt significant in a positive way. My former father-in-law, Lily's paternal grandfather, had reached out 6 months ago asking to be part of her life again. He'd disappeared along with his son when Lily was born, but something about our family's public happiness had prompted him to reconsider his choices. After several careful conversations and a background check that David had insisted upon, we'd agreed to supervised visits that had evolved into a tentative but meaningful relationship. "Lily, sweetheart, come show Dad what you've been working on," I called out as she finished her practice session. She bounced over to the couch, climbing onto David's lap with the casual affection that had developed between them over the years. "I learned the hard part without messing up even once today." "That's amazing. You've been practicing so diligently." David's pride in her accomplishments never felt forced or performative. He'd taken to fatherhood with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else, understanding instinctively that love was demonstrated through consistency and presence rather than grand gestures. "Will there be dancing at your wedding party?" Lily asked, using her term for our vow renewal ceremony. "Absolutely. We've cleared a space in Uncle Tom's backyard specifically for dancing. Are you planning to show off those moves you've been practicing?" She giggled and demonstrated a twirl she'd been perfecting, nearly knocking over David's coffee in the process. The ease and laughter in our daily interactions still felt miraculous to me sometimes. I'd spent so many years walking on eggshells, measuring my words and monitoring everyone's emotional temperature, that the simple pleasure of unguarded family moments continued to surprise me. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah, Victoria's former colleague who'd become an unexpected friend over the past few months. "Confirmed for Saturday. Can't wait to meet David properly and see you two renew your vows." Also, bringing surprise for Lily. Sarah's friendship had been one of the most positive developments to come out of the wedding drama. She'd reached out a month after Victoria's public meltdown, initially to apologize for not speaking up sooner about Victoria's behavior toward me at company events. Our conversation had revealed shared interests in design and social justice, leading to a genuine friendship that existed independently of my relationship with Victoria. "Everything okay?" David asked, noticing my smile as I read the message. "Sarah's bringing a surprise for Lily on Saturday, probably something art-related, knowing her. She's been good for you, having a friend who knows you separate from all the family history." He was right. Sarah saw me as Emma the graphic designer, Emma the mother, Emma the woman with opinions about politics and books and sustainable living. She didn't see me through the lens of family disappointment or dramatic transformation. Her friendship offered a kind of normalcy that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor when Victoria knocked on our apartment door carrying a large garment bag and wearing an expression of nervous excitement. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced," she said as I let her in. "I finished your surprise and couldn't wait until Saturday to show you." Over the past few months, Victoria had been making conscious efforts to rebuild our relationship through small, thoughtful gestures. She'd given Lily art supplies for her birthday instead of the frilly dresses she'd favored in the past. She'd asked about my work projects with genuine interest, even referring a potential client to me. Most significantly, she'd stopped offering unsolicited advice about my life choices, asking permission before sharing opinions or suggestions. "What kind of surprise?" I asked, curiosity overcoming my wariness. "I've been taking a dressmaking class, trying to learn skills that don't involve criticizing other people's choices," she said with self-deprecating humor that would have been impossible for her a year ago. "I wanted to make you something special for Saturday." She unzipped the garment bag to reveal a stunning dress in deep emerald green, cut in a classic style that would flatter my figure without being overly formal. The fabric was beautiful, and the construction looked professional despite being handmade. "Victoria, this is gorgeous. You made this yourself?" "With a lot of help from my instructor and about 6 YouTube tutorials. But yes, I wanted to give you something that came from my hands and my heart, not just my credit card." I held the dress up against myself, examining the careful stitching and thoughtful details. The gesture felt significant, not just because of the time and effort involved, but because it represented Victoria channeling her perfectionist tendencies into something generous rather than competitive. "Try it on," she urged. "I think I got the measurements right, but we can adjust anything that doesn't fit properly." The dress fit perfectly, hugging my curves in all the right places and falling to a flattering length just below my knees. When I emerged from the bedroom, David's expression told me everything I needed to know about how I looked. "Wow," he said, simply. "Victoria, that's incredible work." "Thank you. I've discovered I actually enjoy creating things more than I enjoyed criticizing things." "Who knew?" Lily clapped her hands together with delight. "Mom, you look like a princess, but a grown-up princess who has a job and knows how to drive." The specificity of her compliment made all 3 adults laugh, but it also captured something important about how I felt in that moment. I looked beautiful, but I also looked like myself. The dress enhanced who I was rather than trying to transform me into someone else. "There's one more thing," Victoria said, reaching into her purse to pull out a small jewelry box. "These were Grandma Eleanor's earrings. Mom was saving them for my wedding, but I wore different ones. I thought maybe you'd like to wear them on Saturday, something old and something borrowed." The earrings were delicate silver drops with small pearls, elegant without being ostentatious. I'd always admired them on our grandmother, who died when I was in college. "Are you sure? These should stay in your family." "You are my family," Victoria said firmly. "And Grandma Eleanor always said you had her artistic eye. I think she'd want you to have them." The moment felt heavy with significance, not just because of the gesture itself, but because of what it represented about Victoria's changing understanding of sisterhood and family. She was sharing rather than hoarding, including rather than excluding, celebrating rather than competing. That evening, after Victoria had left and Lily was in bed, David and I sat on our small balcony watching the sunset paint the Hartford skyline in shades of pink and gold. The May air was warm enough for shirt sleeves but cool enough to be comfortable, carrying the green scent of spring growth and the distant sound of children playing in the courtyard below. "Are you nervous about Saturday?" David asked, reaching over to take my hand. Excited nervous, not worried nervous. I keep thinking about how different everything feels compared to 3 years ago when we first got married. How so? When we got married the first time, I felt like I was hiding. not just from my family, but from myself. I was so focused on proving I could be independent that I didn't let myself fully appreciate what we were building together. Saturday feels like a celebration of who we've become, not just as a couple, but as individuals. David squeezed my hand gently. I've been thinking about that too. About how much stronger we both are now, how much clearer we are about what matters. What matters most to you now? This, he said, gesturing to encompass our apartment, our life, the sound of Lily's gentle breathing coming through her open bedroom window. Not the big moments or the dramatic gestures, but the daily choice to build something beautiful together. The ordinary magic of being known and loved completely. That's very philosophical for a Tuesday evening. I've been practicing my vows. Want to hear them? Absolutely not. I want to be surprised on Saturday. He laughed and kissed my forehead. Fair enough, but I will say this. Emma Richardson Chen, these have been the best 3 years of my life, and I can't wait to see what the next 30 bring. Richardson Chen. I've been thinking about that. About taking your name too, making it official that we're building something new together, rather than just joining existing families. The suggestion caught me off guard, but it felt right, in a way I hadn't expected. David taking my name alongside his own would be a visible symbol of the equality and partnership that had always defined our relationship. Saturday arrived with perfect weather, cloudless skies, and temperatures in the mid-70s. Uncle Tom's backyard had been transformed into an intimate outdoor chapel, with white chairs arranged in a semicircle around an arch covered in climbing, roses and baby's breath. Lily had helped Patricia arrange wildflowers in mason jars along the aisle, and the result was rustic elegance that felt authentically us. I spent the morning getting ready in Uncle Tom and Aunt Susan's guest room, surrounded by the women who'd become my chosen family. Sarah did my makeup with professional skill, having volunteered her services as a wedding gift. Patricia helped with my hair, her fingers gentle and sure as she pinned Victoria's handmade veil into place. Even Victoria was there, making final adjustments to the dress and offering encouragement that felt genuine rather than performative. You look radiant, Patricia said, stepping back to admire the final result. Truly beautiful. Thank you. For everything. Not just today, but for the work you've done to rebuild our relationship. Thank you for giving me the chance to try. I know I made mistakes with you girls when you were growing up. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to do better now. Victoria hugged me carefully, mindful of not disturbing my hair or makeup. I'm so proud of you, Em. Not just for finding David and building this beautiful life, but for having the courage to demand better from all of us. You taught me what real strength looks like. The ceremony itself was everything I'd dreamed of and more. David looked handsome in his navy suit, standing beneath the rose-covered arch with tears in his eyes as I walked down the aisle with Lily as my maid of honor. The assembled guests represented every relationship that had enriched our lives, people who'd chosen to love and support us rather than judge or criticize. Uncle Tom officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for our ceremony. His words about love, commitment, and the courage to build authentic relationships resonated with everyone present, many of whom had witnessed our family's transformation over the past year. When it came time for vows, David's words were simple, but profound. Emma, 3 years ago, you taught me that love isn't about fixing each other or completing each other, but about choosing each other every day. You've shown me what it means to be truly partners, to build something beautiful while remaining completely yourself. I promise to keep choosing you, keep celebrating you, and keep working to deserve the gift of your love. My own vows felt inadequate compared to the depth of what I wanted to express. But I spoke from my heart about the man who'd seen my worth when I'd forgotten it myself, who'd loved my daughter as his own, who'd given me the courage to demand better from everyone in my life. David, You didn't rescue me from my circumstances. You loved me into remembering my own strength. You didn't complete me because I was already whole, but you made me better, braver, more authentically myself. I promise to keep growing with you, keep building this beautiful life we've created, and keep choosing love over fear every single day. The reception was a joyful blur of dancing, laughter, and heartfelt toasts. Michael spoke about watching Victoria become a better person through her relationship with our family. Sarah shared stories about my work that made me blush with pride. Even some of David's military friends offered perspective on his character that brought tears to my eyes. But the moment that meant the most came during the father-daughter dance, when David swept Lily around the dance floor while she giggled with pure joy. Watching them together, seeing the love and trust in her eyes as she looked up at the man who'd chosen to be her father, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the family we'd built together. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Patricia approached David and me with a small wrapped package. "This is for both of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Something to commemorate this day and everything it represents." Inside the package was a framed photograph of David, Lily, and me from earlier in the day, captured in a moment of natural laughter during the reception. But it was the inscription on the frame that brought tears to my eyes. The Chen family. Built on love, strengthened by truth, blessed by courage. I wanted you to have something that reflects who you really are, Patricia explained. A family that chose each other, that fought for each other, that refused to accept anything less than authentic love and respect. Later that night, after all the guests had gone home and Lily was asleep in her own bed, David and I sat in our living room still wearing our wedding clothes, too tired to change, but too happy to sleep. The apartment was filled with flowers from the ceremony and gifts from our guests, but it still felt like home rather than a showplace. "Any regrets about doing this publicly this time?" David asked, loosening his tie but not removing it completely. "None. It felt right to celebrate openly, to share our happiness with people who genuinely care about us. I spent so many years hiding my joy because I was afraid someone would take it away from me. Now I know that real joy can't be diminished by other people's opinions." "What's next for us?" I considered the question seriously. We'd talked about having more children, about buying a house with a bigger yard for Lily to play in, about traveling together once David's nonprofit was established. But in that moment, surrounded by evidence of our commitment to each other and our chosen family, the future felt wide open with possibility. "More of this," I said finally. "More ordinary days filled with extraordinary love. More courage to keep being authentically ourselves. More faith that we can handle whatever challenges come our way." Sounds perfect to me. As we finally headed to bed, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. I was still wearing Victoria's handmade dress and Grandma Eleanor's pearl earrings. My hair was slightly mussed from dancing, and my makeup was faded but happy. I looked like a woman who'd spent the evening celebrating with people she loved, surrounded by family she'd chosen rather than simply inherited. Most importantly, I looked like myself. Not the version of myself that my family had wanted me to be. Not the version I'd thought I needed to become to earn love and acceptance. But the woman I'd always been underneath all the doubt and people-pleasing and desperate attempts to prove my worth. The next morning brought sunshine streaming through our bedroom windows and the familiar sounds of Lily playing quietly in her room while David made coffee in the kitchen. Our apartment looked exactly the same as it had a week ago, but everything felt different. Not because we'd renewed our vows or thrown a party, but because we'd reached a place of complete authenticity in our relationships with ourselves and each other. Over breakfast, Lily regaled us with detailed reviews of every aspect of the previous day's celebration, from the flower arrangements to the cake flavors to her favorite dance partners. Her joy was infectious, and I found myself laughing until my sides hurt as she demonstrated some of the dance moves she'd learned from David's veteran friends. "Are we going to have another party next year?" she asked hopefully. "Probably not another wedding," David said with a smile. "But we'll definitely find reasons to celebrate. What kind of party would you want?" "A birthday party for our family. Not for one person, but for all of us together. Because that's when we became a real family. When everyone knew about Dad and we didn't have to keep it secret anymore." Her suggestion was surprisingly insightful. The previous day hadn't just been about renewing our vows or celebrating our marriage. It had been about publicly claiming our identity as a family built on choice rather than obligation, love rather than duty, truth rather than pretense. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said, reaching over to ruffle her hair. "An annual celebration of the Chen family and everyone who chooses to be part of it." As the weeks following our vow renewal settled into routine, I noticed subtle changes in how we moved through the world. David seemed more confident at community events, no longer introducing himself as Emma's husband, but as himself, with his own identity and contributions. Lily talked about our family with obvious pride, sharing stories about our celebration with her friends and teachers. Even I felt different, carrying myself with the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. The transformation wasn't just personal. Our relationships with extended family continued to evolve in positive directions. Patricia had started hosting monthly family dinners that felt inclusive rather than judgmental, celebrations of each person's unique contributions rather than competitions for approval. Victoria had begun reaching out regularly, not to offer advice or criticism, but to share her own struggles and victories as she learned to build authentic relationships. Most surprisingly, other people began seeking us out for advice about their own family challenges. Sarah's sister asked for guidance about setting boundaries with critical parents. One of David's veteran friends wanted to know how we'd built such a strong step-parent relationship. Even Michael confided that watching our family's healing process had inspired him and Victoria to work on their own communication patterns. I realized that by refusing to accept toxic relationship dynamics, by insisting on respect and authenticity, we'd created something that others recognized as valuable. Not because we were perfect, but because we'd found the courage to keep working towards something better. 6 months after our vow renewal, I received an unexpected email that felt like the universe's confirmation that we were on the right path. A local magazine wanted to feature our story in an article about modern families who'd overcome challenges to create strong, loving relationships. They'd heard about us through word of mouth, people who'd been inspired by our journey from secrecy and family dysfunction to openness and healthy boundaries. I discussed the opportunity with David and Lily before responding. The idea of sharing our story publicly felt both exciting and vulnerable, but we ultimately decided that if our experience could help other families find their way to healthier relationships, the risk was worth taking. The interview process was surprisingly therapeutic. Talking through our journey with a thoughtful journalist helped us recognize patterns and progress we'd been too close to see clearly. We'd gone from a family defined by what we were hiding to a family defined by what we were building. We'd learned that love without respect wasn't really love, and that authentic relationships required the courage to be truthfully ourselves, even when others preferred our masks. When the article was published 3 months later, the response was overwhelming. Letters and emails poured in from readers who recognized their own struggles in our story. Support group facilitators asked permission to share our experience with their participants. A local community college invited me to speak about healthy family dynamics in their continuing education program. But the response that meant the most came from Victoria, who called me the day the magazine hit newsstands. "I read the article," she said without preamble. "I'm proud of you for sharing our story, even the parts that made me look terrible." "You don't look terrible. You look human, like someone who made mistakes but found the courage to do better." Still, it couldn't have been easy to be so honest about everything that happened. "Thank you for including the part about my growth. You could have just focused on my failures. Your growth is part of our story. The healing wouldn't have been possible if you hadn't been willing to change." We talked for over an hour, sharing Perspectives on family dynamics and personal growth that would have been impossible during our years of superficial interaction. The conversation felt like the final seal on our renewed sisterhood, proof that authentic relationships were not only possible, but infinitely more rewarding than the performance-based connections we'd maintained for so long. That evening, as David and I read bedtime stories to Lily in her cozy bedroom filled with art supplies and books and evidence of a childhood rich in love and creativity, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. The 8-year-old who'd endured her aunt's wedding speech with quiet dignity had grown into a confident 10-year-old who knew exactly how much she was loved and valued. "Mom," she said as I tucked her blankets around her, "do you think other families will read about us and decide to be nicer to each other?" "I hope so, sweetheart. I hope they'll realize that families can change and grow and become better when people are brave enough to tell the truth and ask for what they deserve. Like how Aunt Victoria learned to be a better sister and Grandma Patricia learned to be a better grandma? Exactly like that." As I turned off her bedroom light and headed back to the living room where David was grading papers for the leadership development course he'd started teaching at the community college, I reflected on how dramatically our definition of success had changed. 3 years ago, I'd measured my worth by external markers, by whether I could prove to my family that I was valuable despite my unconventional choices. Now I measured success by internal markers, by whether I was living authentically, loving, generously, and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate need for approval. I measured it by Lily's confidence and David's contentment and my own sense of peace with the choices we'd made together. The woman who'd stood at the back of Victoria's wedding reception, clutching a cheap purse and bracing for humiliation, seemed like a different person entirely. Not because my circumstances had changed dramatically, though they had improved in countless ways, but because I'd fundamentally altered my relationship with myself and my understanding of what I deserved from the people in my life. I'd learned that real strength wasn't about enduring mistreatment gracefully or keeping peace at any cost. Real strength was about loving yourself enough to demand better, even when demanding better meant walking away from relationships that couldn't evolve. Beyond dysfunction. Most importantly, I'd learned that happiness wasn't something you earned through perfect behavior or selfless sacrifice. Happiness was something you chose, again and again, by surrounding yourself with people who celebrated your authentic self, rather than tolerated your performance of who they wanted you to be. As I settled onto the couch beside David, who immediately wrapped his arm around me without looking up from his papers, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. We'd built something beautiful from the foundation of truth, respect, and the radical belief that every person deserves to be loved exactly as they are. The future stretched ahead of us, full of unknown challenges and opportunities. But I faced it, without the old familiar anxiety about whether I was good enough or worthy enough or strong enough to handle whatever came next. I knew, with the deep certainty that comes from hard-won wisdom, that I was enough exactly as I was, and that the family we'd chosen and built together would be strong enough to weather any storm. Outside our apartment windows, Hartford settled into evening quiet, but inside our small space filled with books and art supplies and evidence of lives lived with intention and love, our story continued. Not the dramatic story of public vindication and family transformation that had started at Victoria's wedding, but the quieter, more sustained story of people who'd found the courage to keep choosing love over fear, truth over pretense, and authentic connection over comfortable lies. It was, I realized, exactly the story I'd always wanted to be living. I just hadn't known I was brave enough to write it myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.